Good morning and welcome to the Point. If you were with us last week, you know we had a discussion with Governor Rick Snyder and with Senator Debbie Stabenow. Our conversation with Senator Stabenow continued, though, as we talked about an important initiative that she is pushing, trying to make higher education more affordable. We thought that part of the discussion was important enough, we wanted to bring that to you this morning. I want to talk about something you've been working on, and that's about making college more affordable for people who want to go, and ways that you think you can do it from a federal level, even though we know there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the state level. But from the federal level, what do you think you can?
Well, first of all, we have way too much debt on the backs of students, young and old, that are coming out of college. The average debt in Michigan is $30,000, and I had a young woman as my guest at the State of the Union last year who's coming out of Michigan State, my alma mater. This is not anything on Michigan State, but she had to borrow for everything, no help from her folks, and so she's coming out with $100,000 in debt.
It's like having a house.
It's like buying a house.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that the realtors have now made college affordability one of the key issues for them when they come into Washington, they can't qualify young couples or young people to be able to buy a house because of college debt. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. And we're telling people, do the right thing, work hard, go to college, get skills, and then they're faced with this horrible situation. So the In the Red Act is three parts: lower interest rates so that they're low enough that the federal government is not making money off the backs of students and student loans. So lower the student interest rate, raise the Pell Grant so that more lower income young people have the opportunity to be able to go to college. And then thirdly, first 2 years of college, community college or job training, tuition free, so that people are able to go to community college, get the workforce development job training that they need, and not have to pay tuition. Now, I would then keep going because the goal ought to be debt-free college, but this is something that's eminently doable. First 2 years of community college or job training, tuition free, raise Pell Grant amounts every year, lower student loan interest rates. You would see thousands of dollars difference a year for students.
There's somebody out sitting in front of their television right now that says, Senator, that sounds like a fine idea. How are you going to pay for it?
Well, what we're suggesting is that we actually do something that Warren Buffett talked about called the Buffett rule, which is set a minimum tax rate so that wealthy people can't use tax loopholes to get out of paying their taxes. So we're talking about close a couple of tax loopholes, and that more than pays for what needs to be done. And frankly, we need to reinvest in our country, in education, and opportunity to drive the economy. One of the things I worry about, the National Association of Manufacturers have said there's 600,000 unfilled skilled jobs right now, waiting for people. If they had the right skills matched up in manufacturing. We need to let folks get the training that they need to be able to get those good paying jobs. And then we need to make sure that everybody who's got a big dream and is willing to work hard can actually get that degree and come out of college and start the business or become a doctor or do whatever they want to do, and know that they're not going to spend the majority of their life trying to dig out of a big hole of debt.
Our thanks to Senator Stabenow, and continuing our conversation about education on a much different level, Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley. Let's talk a little bit about a group of recommendations that you and a large group of people have been talking about for a long time. I think the last time you were on the show, you had just started the process of trying to figure out how to make sure that children, regardless of where their learning abilities are, have the ability to reach their full potential. We were just talking with Senator Stabenow a few minutes ago about some of her initiatives for higher education. Seems to me that in the pursuit of public service, education of kids at all levels is one of the more noble callings. So as you look at this, what do you think came out of these recommendations that you presented in late February?
There's a lot of discussion around education reform, and there always has been. But left out of that really is the area of special education, and that's really where we zeroed in on here is how can we help kids that might have learning disabilities or other types of disabilities, and help them to reach their highest and best potential. So we took a very comprehensive look and started with just talking to parents and students, educators, administrators from all across the state, just asking how do you feel about the system that you're getting and the services you're getting today and their effectiveness. And out of that came a series of recommendations. And the most important aspect is to create this framework around special education with an emphasis on inclusion, first of all. That segregation of students that's yesterday's way, and that inclusion of students is really critically important. But then, but also to recognize that every single student has a different level of need in terms of help or services in order to reach their best potential. And as their needs increase, the intensity of services around the student should increase. We call that multi-tiered systems of support. It presupposes that kids are going to be together. In other words, we're going to have very inclusive classrooms, but that we don't put kids in a box. We don't just say, okay, this kid has this diagnosis and therefore here's the box that we're going to keep them in. Instead, we say, what does that child need? We start with the needs of the child and we build the services around them. And then on top of that, we want to implement what's called positive behavior interventions and supports around students. Evidence shows that that's a much more effective behavior management tool than the old corporate punishment style of the past, particularly for kids with special needs, but for the entire student population.
Let's talk a little bit about that old school way, because I'm old enough, and you're younger than I, but I'm old enough to recall when there was complete segregation and there was no ability for those children who may have had whatever level of learning disability to interact or take mainstream classes as we thought of them then. Now, fortunately, some of that has changed over the course of those 100 and so years since I was in elementary school, but seriously, the idea of having all students participate in a more open environment is still not something that is being done everywhere all the time.
We've made some progress in this area, but that's why the recommendations and then the implementation of the recommendations from this report includes a lot of professional development work. Because if you think about from a standpoint of teachers that may have been educated themselves back at a time when segregation was the go-to strategy, now we're asking more of teachers than we ever have before in terms of being able to educate and manage a classroom that includes students that might have different levels of disabilities and brain disorders and behavior challenges. And that's what we're trying to do here is to better equip schools to be inclusive, but most importantly to build the experience around what the child needs. And it's if you have a totally separate or segregated system, you're not going to get, separate is not equal. You're not going to get equal results that way. And so we're really trying to equip schools with the ability to do this, manage behaviors more effectively, and then to allow then more of the staff time and the students' time to be spent on academics.
There's no parent, no feeling parent, that listens to this proposal and suggests that it's a bad idea. On the other hand, there are parents that say, well, wait a minute. Classrooms in some cases are already too big. Teachers are already overtaxed. So if you try to accomplish this model, are you going to put more teachers in the classroom? And if you are, where is that going to come from a funding standpoint? I need not tell you, as a former member of the legislature and as a member of this administration, school financing is always a hot topic in Lansing.
It really is, and that's why I think that the professional development is a really important aspect of where you start. When you have kids that are in center-based programs, those are actually the most expensive way to educate a child. And there are some circumstances where that may be appropriate, but more and more often what we're trying to do is get students and put them in with populations that look like our communities and give other students the ability to spend time with a child with a disability so they can grow up and having that just be the way that they expect our communities to work and to operate. So while there's always a cost, today we're bearing a lot of cost because we have a system that segregates students out. I think it is really the most expensive way to go. But we are proposing to put into this year's budget professional development resources to help better equip the teaching staff themselves with both positive behavior interventions and support training and know-how, but then also to help schools themselves put in place this multi-tiered systems of support framework so that we can to better match up the needs of the student with the services available. The schools that have already gone down this road in terms of better behavior management practices have made a huge impact on where they put their resources. So today, if you were to talk to teachers in nearly any school district, and this is something that's surveyed from time to time, you'll find very consistently over the last 30 years that behavior management is one of the top 3 concerns or challenges that teachers face. And if we can better equip them with the more up-to-date behavior management practices, then it allows them to take more of their time, attention, and focus and put it toward academics so that we can have better performance in our students. And one of the things that comes out of this recommendation is that positive behavior support is in place of something else, which is restraint and seclusion practices today. There are still schools that use restraints on kids in non-emergency situations, and also a lot of schools that still use sensory deprivation rooms. They call them seclusion rooms, both of which are proven to be very ineffective ways of managing behavior for children. In fact, they tend to make behavior worse and to escalate over time. It puts the students in danger and the staff in danger. And the positive behavior interventions and supports are much more likely to result in de-escalation and better behavior over time. So when you do put all these things together, then it means that the school can spend more of their time and resources toward academics.
Talk to me a little bit about that positive behavior and how you try to encourage that. And again, I'm thinking back to my days in school to children who today might be diagnosed with attention deficit disorder or some other type of problem that keeps them from learning. But back then it was in the hall, 5 SWATs and set up for the next 3 hours, which wasn't necessarily a seclusion chamber, but they weren't learning anything when they were sitting out in the hallway. So I assume part of that is what you're trying to get at.
Yeah, and the idea is to try and make sure that we understand when there's a problematic behavior that all behavior is a communication of some sort, and what is that child trying to communicate? So it requires essentially an analysis, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this big, complicated analysis, but it's an idea of what was the antecedent, what was the thing that instigated the behavior in the first place, and then what was the behavior, and what are the consequences of the behavior. And so we think of it ABCs: antecedent, behavior, consequence. And so as we look to try and impact that, there can be good consequences and bad consequences of behavior. But you might have a child, for example, that doesn't like mathematics, and so they learn over time that if I throw a fit when the math test comes out, they send me out to the hall, so I no longer have to do my math. And so what's happening is the antecedent is math, the behavior is I throw a fit, the consequence, which to the child is a positive consequence, is I get to get out of my math work. And so it's really understanding that sometimes the old way of doing things actually reinforces problematic behaviors instead of trying to help that student develop more appropriate responses to things that they struggle with.
We're back with more of our conversation with Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. We continue our conversation with Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley. Let's talk about something else you've been involved in, and this is something that I think deserves some explanation. First of all, what you're talking about in general, and then how it applies in our communities. And you're talking about strategies to improve behavioral health systems. Describe a behavioral health system.
This is a big area of healthcare. I think of it as like healthcare from the neck up. So we're all familiar with healthcare from the neck down, which is the majority of our healthcare system. But we have a very segregated system today, where we get our healthcare from the neck up in one system, and our healthcare from the neck down in another system. And so what we're trying to do is to get better integration between those two. And there's a bunch of different ways that this can be accomplished, but really what we need are for the systems themselves to be very intentional about work and putting these things together. So if you have somebody that might have some sort of a brain disorder, it could be a substance use disorder or addiction, it could be autism or or maybe Down syndrome, that there are certain aspects of therapies that help with a person's developing the sorts of functions and things that they need to do to be successful and independent and live a more self-determined life. Those fit into the area called behavioral health care. And then and it's different than mental health care, although these things do they do tend to be together in different systems. So if you were to go to your local community mental health here in Kent County, that would be Network 180. You'd find that they do mental health care, they do behavioral health care, and they also do substance use health care as well, substance use disorder health care. So it's really, globally, I like to think of these things as basically anything that is the care or the health care around the brain, save for things like brain surgery and that sort of aspect of it, but really the health care of the brain.
How do we as a society respond to that? Because it's the old analogy. If you have a broken leg, somebody puts a cast on your leg, they don't think a second thing about it. But if it has something to do, as you say, from the neck up, very often people appear, even today, in 2016, to be a little less ready to accept a diagnosis or treatment.
There's an extraordinary stigma around any kind of brain disorder, and it's something that we have to get past. It's one of the barriers that we see to people getting help, whether it is a mental illness or in cases of developmental disabilities. And even in my own family, I have a daughter with autism, and I remember when she first got that diagnosis, it felt isolating, like we were kind of hidden away from the world for a while until we really were determined to just get out there and live again. And that's really what we need is for there to be more awareness about what it is. When you have a healthcare matter that is connected to your brain, it shouldn't be considered any differently than when you have a healthcare aspect, if it's having to do with your, mental illness, for example, is a chronic healthcare issue. I don't know why we would look at it any different than heart disease or looking at it any different than being diabetic, for example. That really this is an organ of the body, and that sometimes that organ needs different types of interventions and care in order to reach its highest potential. And the faster that we can get to a point where we look at that as the same as any other organ and just another part of healthcare and something that needs to be treated the same, then I think that's when we'll make the most advancement, because there's so much you can do, but oftentimes people are afraid to seek that help because of that stigma around it.
So what is your effort in this vein right now? Because it seems that as you started talking about education for children that may have some learning disabilities, and you took that to a recommendation stage. Is that where you are now with this?
So there's special education, I think is a critically important part of it, but also employment services. People with serious mental illnesses and developmental disabilities have very, very low rates of employment, despite the fact that they have huge potential. I mean, think about if you're a person with a disability, just to get through the day. The world is not designed around you if you have a disability. Just to get through the day, you have to be hardworking, you have to have perseverance, you have to be creative and innovative and determined. Those are all the types of characteristics that a company would really want to have in their workforce. And so that's part of it, is to work on the demand side and show employers that you got this talented workforce that has all the characteristics that you want, that you never really thought about before, or maybe have never thought about before. So employment is a part of it. Transportation is a big part of it too. But there's so if you think about those issues as being kind of the nuts and bolts of it. But I also spend a lot of time trying to get people to see the value in the diversity and the way a person's brain might work. I'll give you the example of Down syndrome. I've never met a person with Down syndrome that has been anything other than sincere. So I work in politics, you work with people in politics all the time. And how much time is spent trying to figure out what are the sincere intentions of the person that I'm dealing with right now. I've never wondered that about a person with Down syndrome. So who has the disability? I mean, to really see the beauty and the value in the way a person is, instead of just seeing the disability, why not choose to see the good?
I want to come back to this, and on another show, I want to have a longer conversation because I think this is a very interesting concept, one that you have talked about before, but I think it's one that is interesting, particularly as we reach an employment rate in this state where we are going to have more and more jobs that are available, and we're going to need to use more and more available workforce. And I think part of that is an interesting dovetail to what you're talking about. But let's talk about a subject I know that you spent a lot of time on. And what I'm about to say will make you laugh, because when I say we get a lot of phone calls, it's nothing compared to what you and the administration get when it comes to the water crisis in Flint. But one of the things I told you just before we started that I found somewhat interesting is early on when we started seeing thousands and thousands and thousands of bottles of water going to Flint because people so desperately needed them, I was surprised to find that some people bothered to question what happens to the plastic bottles. That was the furthest thing from my mind. Not that it isn't legitimate, but obviously the most important thing was getting fresh water to the people in Flint. But not so long ago, you, along with others, have started a process that answers that question that I would have never thought to ask. What is that?
So what Flint has available to it now, and this is, I think, characteristic of a lot of the work that is happening on the ground, is we want to do things that help address the immediate need. So water delivery and then recycling opportunities for those water bottles. But then wouldn't it be great if long after the crisis was over, that community had a legacy of recycling that was left behind? And so that city has curbside recycling available at no additional charge above what is paid for their regular trash service. But then also there are different recycling companies that are at each of the water stations where people pick up their water, and they can bring in a clear bag that they pick right up at the water station. They can bring in bags full of these water bottles and just put them in a bin for recycling there. So what we're doing our best to get as many of those water bottles, literally millions of water bottles, back into recycling. There's value in that material itself, but the more immediate concern is how do we make sure that there's not a detrimental impact to the environment because of the crisis response itself.
We don't have very much time left, and one of the questions that has kind of plagued me when I think about this, having known you for a number of years, and your demeanor is always rather smooth, but this has been a giant upheaval for the state of Michigan, the perspective that people have. You and I were talking last summer over at MIS about Pure Michigan and how impactful that had been around the country. And certainly this has an impact on that. The most immediate and most obvious and the most concerning is the impact on the people in the city of Flint. But what has this done with the way you carry out your day-to-day activity as the lieutenant governor in an administration who is focusing so much time on Flint?
I saw a unique opportunity really to get involved in the recovery efforts. Since I've never been involved with the emergency manager activities of the past, I could really go in with fresh eyes, without a lot of the baggage of the past, and just work on the recovery with the community. And that's the main message. When I decided to spend about 3 days a week there, that's what I aim for each week, to be on the ground in Flint. And the idea is that all the recovery efforts need to be with and through people there in Flint, because someday the water crisis will be over and the state's response will go back to a normal state involvement in any other city. And so what we want to have is a city that has a sustainable ability to deliver services over time. But there's an education component, nutrition, the healthcare system, on top of the infrastructure, and then economic development. Those are all the things that are happening in that city right now. And my work is really to connect the people in the communities, in the community, in order to make sure that our work is really equipping the community with the ability to carry on in a sustainable way the work that is done in the recovery. And so I'm determined that after this is all done, that the community will be left stronger than it was before. Anything less is just not enough.
We're back with more To the Point in just a moment. We're all out of time this Sunday morning. We'll see you next Sunday with Congressman Bill Huizenga. To the Point.